Alberto is going to be talking about. Of course, Alberto is with Moonbeam. He's head of developer relations at Moonbeam, and he's going to be talking about extending XCM capabilities to ERC-20s. So I'm looking forward to hearing this. You have your time starts now, sir. So we're 20 minutes behind the schedule if you are following the schedule, and we'll just be 20 minutes ahead of whatever the time says. Okay, so Alberto, take it away. Thank you so much. There's your microphone, sir. Give him a hand, guys.
Thanks. Hello, hello. Cool. Yeah, so thanks for coming. Today I'm going to speak to you about extending XCM capabilities to ERC-20s. Like he said, my name is Alberto, and I work at developer relations at Moonbeam. So I always like to give sort of introductions that lead to the point that I'm discussing in the presentation. And so first, let's talk about substrate assets at ERC-20s. Some of you are familiar with Polkadot, right? I mean, hopefully. And so in the Polkadot ecosystem, we're talking about interoperability within parachains that can transfer assets. I mean, a lot more than assets, but for the sake of this presentation, we'll focus it on assets. And these things, we can name them substrate assets, right? And so within all the participants of the Polkadot ecosystem, these assets can flow freely between them and so on using XCM. And so basically, we like in Moonbeam, we like to sort of separate things, the things that are substrate based to something called the substrate API. And this means that you can interact with substrate assets using the substrate API to transfer them around the Polkadot ecosystem. But on Moonbeam, we introduced a new concept, I think it was 2 years ago with Moonriver, called XC20s. And basically, XC20s are substrate assets, right? So they can flow using XCM around the Polkadot ecosystem. But because in Moonbeam, we're focused on Ethereum compatibility, we added sort of like an Ethereum compatible layer on top of that, that it's basically an ERC-20 interface for these substrate assets. This means that any substrate asset on Moonbeam will have the typical transfer function, the typical approve functions that are really familiar for Ethereum developers. And so this actually means that any EVM application that is built on Moonbeam, like a DEX, a lending protocol, or whatever, can use this ERC-20 interface to add these tokens to their EVM application. And so as always in Moonbeam, we're focused on making sure that these sort of like Polkadot narratives are accessible for Ethereum developers, and XC20s is an example of that. So we introduced basically two types of XC20s that it's going to change with this talk. But the first one is called external XC20s, which is basically assets from other chains that are represented on Moonbeam as ERC-20s. This is, for example, DOT, the Polkadot token. We call it XC DOT. We have also, for example, the A-star token. It's called, the XC A-star or whatever, and so on. And the other type of XC20s is called the mintable XC20s, which is basically assets, substrate assets that are on Moonbeam that can be transferred to other parachains. I think the only example that actually was created on Moonbeam was called Poop, the Poop token. That was the name. And it was actually created by the Moonsama team. So they created natively on Moonbeam, and then they transferred out to the Moonsama parachain, okay? But it was called Poop. So basically, one of the main issue with this sort of like concept of XC20s, as I just presented, is that ERC-20s don't really like XCM. I mean, XCM exists at a substrate level, at a Polkadot level, and ERC-20s exist at an EVM level, okay? So I can create the world famous Albert token as an ERC-20 on Moonbeam, but that doesn't mean that Albert token can be transferred via XCM to other parachains, which is a big blocker if you're thinking about interoperability. And so with that, we are introducing with the latest runtime on Moonbeam something that we call now XCM enables ERC-20s, which is sort of like the new XC20s, the revamped XC20s now. We don't have this sort of differentiation because this means that any ERC-20 on Moonbeam is now XCM enabled and can be sent to other parachains in the ecosystem. And so let's go briefly, without going into a lot of technicalities, on how is this possible. So basically, if you're familiar with XCM, there's something called the asset transactor. And the asset transactor will basically say, okay, if you want to transact an asset, which type of like thing are you going to use? Are you going to use a typical substrate asset transactor? In this case, we introduced one called the ERC XCM bridge transactor. It's just a fancy name. You don't really have to understand it from a practical perspective. And so now the only requirement for ERC-20s to be sent or shipped via XCM to any parachain in the Polkadot ecosystem, it's basically they have to have the standard ERC-20 interface. More importantly, the transfer function, all right? That's the baseline requirement. And that the transfer has to be completed within 80,000 gas units, okay? So if you have a very custom implementation of transfer that transferred the tokens but does XYZ, and this requires more than 80,000 gas units, this is not for you. But this was hard-coded values that are mandatory so that your assets can be shipped via this new type of configuration. So, and the third thing is that the main difference of XCM-enabled ERC-20s on Moonbeam is that they maintain the full Ethereum compatibility. This means that you will have EVM locks, which is really important for example, indexers, right? If you're trying to index this data using any sort of EVM indexer, this is really important for traceability purposes. So let's do diagrams. I love diagrams. So I created something called the Albert token. And so it's an ERC-20 token on Moonbeam EVM. And so if I actually, by the way, this is not a joke. This is a joke, sorry. This is not financial advice. I mean, this is just a token for example, right? And so if you transfer Albert token via the EVM, right? This is in MetaMask, for example, you will have EVM execution and then you will have Ethereum locks. That is how every ERC-20 token transfer works. I mean, at a very simplified, steps, let's say. But then if you want to transfer it via XCM, the way that this will work is that this new type of XCM asset transactor will actually take on that transfer and will do on Moonbeam EVM calls to transfer these tokens to what it's called the sovereign account of the parachain. So if we're, I saw it there. So if we're transferring to Fala, for example, Fala will actually hold these tokens on the sovereign account, and then the XCM flow will continue as is. And how this is done is basically the ERC-20 XCM bridge will call the EVM to do the EVM token transfer as any sort of like MetaMask token transfer. This means that you will have Ethereum locks. And then on the next step, we will have the typical XCM transfer as any other substrate asset that you've ever done. If you're an end user, it will be completely seamless, okay? So the main benefit is that you have the Ethereum locks, which is super important for EVM compatibility purposes. So this is quite small. You probably don't see it, but if you scan the QR code at the end of the presentation, you will probably see it better. This is a Moonscan or Etherscan clone, I mean the Etherscan of Moonbeam, basically, on their testnet. And you can see that these are like basically ERC-20 token transfers to in and out of the sovereign account, right? So this is proof that you're keeping Ethereum compatibility. So with that, that was all a segue to introduce you to the new thing that we're sort of like in the process of rolling out, which is called Moonbeam routed liquidity. It's a very catchy name. So if you think about what this means, right? ERC-20s that are XCM enabled now, this is a big unblocker for multiple things. I mean, Albert token can be anywhere now, which is always great, but you also have much more possibilities than that. And one of them is called Moonbeam routed liquidity. So it's a way to basically bridge in and out liquidity into Polkadot parachains. This means that any bridge that is connected with Moonbeam, you can bridge any token that you want from Ethereum, Avalanche, Polygon, whatever other blockchain to a Polkadot parachain without that parachain needing to be connected with that bridge. Okay, so let's say, for example, you want to bring USDC or ETH, for example, ETH from Ethereum to Hydra DX or to Manta. Manta doesn't need to be connected with Wormhole or Axelar. They can use Moonbeam as a path, as a gateway to get to that liquidity. And that's what Moonbeam routed liquidity unlocks. So you can bridge any XC20s from and to parachains. Another cool use case is that, for example, the Manta team wants to bring their token to Ethereum for whatever purpose they would like to do that. And they can do that as well with Moonbeam routed liquidity. So Moonbeam routed liquidity is bridge agnostic. It doesn't necessarily mean that any bridge can actually adapt to Moonbeam routed liquidity, which actually unlocks a lot of like possible blockchains. The only thing that the bridge needs to do is a transfer token with payload, okay? You need to transfer the ERC-20 to Moonbeam with a certain payload that will execute and build the XCM message that is gonna route that token to the destination parachain. And we'll go through this in a bit. Oh, sorry about that. And then we are launching MRL with Wormhole as the first sort of bridge that supports MRL. Like I said, this is not a solution that is only specific to Wormhole, but Wormhole is working with us and with other teams to sort of bring MRL to some parachain teams that have expressed interest. And so let me take you step by step, high level, of how MRL is going to work. I mean, sadly, the sun doesn't really does justice to the diagram that I'm going to show you, but hopefully you can see at least a bit of it, right? So we have here Ethereum. This is Ethereum, and a user in Ethereum is doing a token transfer with payload. I mean, it will be a really nice UX, UI, that you just have like to select what token do you want, what parachain you want to do, but this is what's happening underneath. So basically, something called the Wormhole Guardians, it's basically what the Wormhole Guardians is what allows to check whether these messages are valid or not, are going to check, hey, buddy, this message on Ethereum is valid. Please go ahead and continue moving forward these tokens to the parachain that you want to transfer them to. Then something called the relayer. The relayer, the only thing that its job is to basically say, okay, the Guardians approved this message. I'm going to execute the message on Moonbeam. And so the relayer basically will work with Moonbeam and something that we call the GMP precompile, which is just a fancy name for a sort of like an interface for a functionality to interact with the Wormhole bridge contract. And basically, when the message is executed on Moonbeam, these tokens will be minted, this wrapped version of the token, wrap ETH, wrap USDC, and so on, and they will be atomically shipped to the parachain that we're targeting, okay? So it will be atomic. There's no like, okay, the tokens will be held in this address, and then you need to sort of execute it and send it somewhere. So the beauty of it is that this looks really complicated, but it'll be just one click by a user signing a message on Ethereum, for example, and that's it. The tokens will actually go to the parachain that they want to route it to. And so actually this morning, I did not have time to include it in the presentation, but this morning, one of the teams that is working on the UI showed a demo, like a live demo of the app live, basically working with like the typical loader that is saying, hey, your message is being routed and so on. On the way back, just to summarize it, basically, right now you need to send 2 XCM messages from the parachain to Moonbeam, stating that you want to transfer these assets back to Moonbeam, and then doing what is called a remote transact. What you're actually calling the Moonbeam EVM via XCM to say, hey, buddy, I want to transfer these tokens out through the Wormhole sort of like set of contracts. And so then basically the Wormhole contracts will actually talk to the Guardians, and then the Guardians will say, okay, this message is okay. Please relayer, execute your token transfer back to Ethereum, and then the flow basically repeats itself, basically bridging back the tokens from, let's say, the Manta parachain back to Ethereum. This flow actually is pretty similar if you want to bring Manta tokens to Ethereum, right? So it's kind of reversible in that sense. So yeah, if you're a parachain and you want to implement Moonbeam routed liquidity, we also call it MRL. That's also a pretty cool acronym. So there are basically 3 requirements that you need to have. Basically, the first one is 8 RMP channels open from and to Moonbeam. So all the parachains that are already connected via XCM to Moonbeam and from Moonbeam, they can actually use MRL. The second thing that they need to do, and this is, I mean, kind of obvious as well, is that they need to be able to support the token, right? If they want the world famous Albert token, they need to register, right? Because if not, you could just spam tokens all across the block, the parachains. That's not really feasible or great. So for example, they would have to register Albert token, whatever USDC version they want, whatever USDT version they want. They need to register, and the moment that they register it, that's it basically. And the third requirement is more for the way back. So if you want to bring back liquidity, you need to have what is called remote transact support. So that is a very specific thing about XCM, that you need to be able to allow certain specific calls that it's called within the XCM transact instruction. So yeah, I think that's basically all I had for you. The idea is that Moonbeam can act as a gateway in and out of the Polkadot ecosystem. Like I said before, this is not only Wormhole specific, even though we're launching MRL with Wormhole, but I mean, we hope to also support any other sort of GMP protocol as parachains basically demand it, right? So at the end of the day, the idea is that Moonbeam, this is one of the connected contracts strategy that we've been talking about in the past year, in which Moonbeam can act as a sort of port of call in and out of the Polkadot ecosystem, to connect them to any other sort of ecosystem like Avalanche, Cosmos, Ethereum, and more. So yeah, thanks a lot for your attention. If you want to check, the QR code for the slides are there. On the left-hand side, you can see all the networks for Moonbeam. The website is at the bottom, moonbeam.network. If you're interested in MRL and you want to sort of get onboarded or get started, you can actually ping me in Telegram, AlbertoV19. We're super responsive and we're eager to hear from parachains that want to sort of access this sort of liquidity mechanism that we're presenting. So yeah, thanks a lot. Do we have time for questions?
Great job, Alberto. Unfortunately, we are pushed for time, but that was a very engaging talk. So I'll tell you what, I'll give you one public question. Okay, how about that? Anyone want to ask a question for Alberto? Oh, now I've put everyone on the spot, right? Just one question, and no one wants to break the ice.
Either way, I'll be around. So I mean, if you have any questions, just look for the Moonbeam T-shirt, and I'm happy sort of to answer anything that you might have. So
Awesome.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Alberto. Appreciate that.